The courtroom was alive with activity, its walls echoing with the murmurs of anticipation. Lawyers, dressed in sharp suits, carried stacks of files and whispered strategies to their clients. The air was thick with tension. This was no ordinary trial. A high-profile case, splashed across headlines for weeks, was about to begin. Journalists with notepads and cameras were perched on the edge of their seats, ready to catch every word. In the middle of the commotion, a man quietly entered the room. He was in his late 50s, with streaks of gray in his hair, and a face that seemed familiar, yet unremarkable. His clothes were simple: a plain button-down shirt and worn-out slacks. No tie, no polished shoes. He looked out of place among the polished professionals and impeccably dressed spectators. He moved with a calm confidence, but avoided drawing attention. Choosing a seat in the back corner of the room, he folded his hands in his lap and waited. No one noticed him at first. He blended into the background, like a shadow against the wall. But the peace didn't last long. A court officer, scanning the room, spotted the man and frowned. He began walking toward him, setting the stage for what would soon become an unforgettable day in that courtroom. The court officer stopped in front of the man, towering over him with an air of authority. "Sir, can I help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't offering help at all. The man looked up, his expression calm but tired. "No, thank you. I'm fine where I am." The officer's eyes narrowed, scanning the man from head to toe. His clothes, his quiet demeanor, everything about him screamed that he didn't belong here. "Do you have a reason to be in this courtroom?" "I do," the man replied simply. "Well, it's not open to the public. If you don't have business here, you need to leave," the officer said, his voice firm. The man hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I have business here," he said again, his voice low but steady. The officer crossed his arms. "You don't look like a lawyer, and you're certainly not a witness. Either state your purpose or step outside." Others in the courtroom began to notice the exchange. A few snickers rose from the spectators, and some whispered among themselves. The man's lack of reaction only seemed to irritate the officer further. "I'm asking you one last time," the officer said, his patience wearing thin. "Leave now, or I'll have to escort you out." The man glanced around the room, his gaze briefly meeting the curious eyes of onlookers. Then, with a small sigh, he replied, "I told you, I belong here." The officer didn't wait for more. He signaled to another guard, and together they grabbed the man by his arms. Despite his protests, they began dragging him toward the door. "Hey," someone whispered loudly from the back. "Who does this guy think he is? Probably just some crazy drifter," another voice muttered. The man didn't resist as they led him out. His expression was composed, though his eyes carried a weight of frustration. The courtroom door slammed shut behind him, leaving a ripple of laughter and murmurs in his wake. But as the commotion settled, no one could have guessed just how wrong they were. The officers escorted the man to the hallway outside the courtroom, their grip firm but not harsh. He didn't resist or raise his voice, even as a few people in the corridor turned to stare. One of the officers leaned in closer, his tone edged with annoyance. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is a professional space. You can't just wander in like you own the place." The man adjusted his shirt, still calm. "I told you, I have business here. You've made a mistake," the officer snorted. "The only mistake here is letting you take up everyone's time. Now move along before we call security to escort you out of the building entirely." The man's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. Instead, he stepped aside, leaning against the cold marble wall, as the officers turned to head back inside. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the double doors of the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with whispers and laughter. "Did you see that guy?" one observer said, chuckling. "What was he thinking? Probably wanted to see the trial," another replied. "Thought he could just waltz in. Guess he found out the hard way." The incident quickly became the topic of conversation as the minutes ticked by. Lawyers and clerks prepared their materials, but there was an undercurrent of impatience. The trial was supposed to have started already, but the judge was nowhere to be seen. The court clerk checked the time for the third time in 5 minutes and frowned. "Has anyone seen Judge Evans?" she asked one of the assistants. "No," came the reply. "I thought he was already here." The delay stretched longer, and the murmurs of confusion grew louder. Meanwhile, The man who had been kicked out stood silently in the hallway, his eyes fixed on the courtroom doors. He hadn't moved, and his calm expression now carried a hint of resolve. For those inside, the delay was simply an inconvenience. But for the man outside, it was the beginning of a revelation that no one in that courtroom would forget. The man lingered in the hallway, leaning against the wall, as though he had all the time in the world. He folded his arms, watching as people continued to filter into the courtroom. Lawyers strode past him, their faces etched with focus, clutching briefcases stuffed with legal documents. Reporters hurried by, their pens clicking as they readied themselves for the trial of the month. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a janitor cleaning a spill, ignored by the bustling professionals. The man's gaze softened as he observed the worker, a subtle recognition passing over his face. He glanced back at the courtroom doors, his expression unreadable. Through the small windows on the doors, he caught glimpses of the room. It was filling up quickly, with every seat taken, and people standing along the back wall. The courtroom hummed with activity, but the one chair that mattered most, the judge's bench, remained conspicuously empty. The man shifted his weight, his patience unbroken. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, as a court clerk rushed past him, clearly frazzled. He overheard snippets of her hurried conversation with another staff member. "He's still not here," she said, exasperated. "We're running 20 minutes behind, and no one can reach him." The other staffer shrugged helplessly. "Maybe he's stuck in traffic or something." The man straightened slightly, his calm demeanor masking the tension brewing beneath the surface. He checked his watch but made no move to leave. Inside, the delay was beginning to irritate the courtroom crowd. A few restless spectators tapped their feet, or whispered complaints. The lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, their carefully prepared arguments beginning to feel like wasted effort. The man outside remained still, letting the chaotic scene unfold without interfering. But his eyes, sharp and steady, held a quiet confidence. It was as though he already knew how the day would end. For now, though, he waited. The wheels of justice were turning, slowly but inevitably, toward a moment that would change everything. Inside the courtroom, tension was mounting. What had begun as mild confusion over the delayed start was quickly turning into frustration. Lawyers paced nervously, their carefully prepared arguments feeling stale as they waited. Spectators whispered among themselves, their curiosity shifting to impatience. "Where is the judge?" a lawyer muttered to a colleague. "This is highly unprofessional. I've never seen him late before," the colleague replied, glancing at the empty bench. Something must have happened. The court clerk tried to maintain composure as she moved between the lawyers and staff, but the strain was evident in her voice. "I've tried calling his office and his assistant, but there's no response," she said to one of the clerks. The delay grew longer, and the restless crowd began speculating loudly. "Do you think they'll postpone the trial?" someone in the back asked. "They can't," another replied. "This case is too important. The media would eat them alive." The murmurs rose into a dull roar of voices, creating a chaotic undercurrent in the room. It was a far cry from the order and authority typically associated with a courtroom. At that moment, the courtroom doors swung open. Everyone turned, expecting to see Judge Evans stride in, his black robe billowing, ready to restore order. But it was only the court clerk, stepping out with a harried expression. She scanned the hallway, her eyes landing on the man who had been expelled earlier. He was still standing by the wall, his hands clasped behind his back, watching quietly. The clerk hesitated, then approached him. "Sir, I need to ask you to leave the premises. This area is restricted," she said, her tone more polite than the officer's. The man tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze meeting hers. "Are you looking for Judge Evans?"
Oh.
he asked. The clerk blinked, taken aback by the unexpected question. "Yes, we are. Do you know where he is?" The man straightened, his voice steady and unyielding.
I do.
"You're looking at him." The clerk froze, her mouth opening slightly in shock. For a moment she simply stared, unable to reconcile the man's simple appearance with the title he claimed. "You're Judge Evans?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded. "Yes, and I'd like to return to my courtroom now." The clerk's face turned pale as the weight of his words sunk in. Without another word, she turned and rushed back into the room, her footsteps echoing like a drumroll leading to the revelation that would shake the courtroom to its core. The courtroom buzzed with confusion as the clerk re-entered, her face pale and her steps hurried. She made her way to the front, leaned toward one of the senior staff members, and whispered something urgent. Their eyes widened, and they quickly gestured toward the door. "What's going on now?" a lawyer muttered, his irritation barely concealed. Before anyone could answer, the doors opened again, and the man who had been expelled earlier walked in, his steps deliberate, his presence suddenly commanding. The murmurs in the room grew louder as people recognized him as the same person who had been dragged out just moments ago. "What's he doing back here?" someone whispered loudly. "Didn't they throw him out?" The man didn't flinch at the murmurs or the stares. Instead, he walked straight to the front of the room, stopping at the bench that had remained empty for far too long. The clerk, still visibly flustered, cleared her throat and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "please rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Evans." The room fell silent, the collective gasp of shock almost audible. Slowly, the crowd stood, their disbelief hanging thick in the air. The man climbed the steps to the bench, his simple clothes a stark contrast to the authority he now exuded. Once seated, he glanced around the room, his steady gaze meeting the eyes of those who had mocked him earlier. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "I apologize for the delay. I was momentarily detained." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room as people realized what he meant. The officer who had thrown him out stood frozen near the side of the room, his face pale as the implications set in. Judge Evans continued, his tone even but sharp. "Before we proceed with today's case, I feel it is necessary to address what has just occurred. You see, I arrived early this morning, dressed as I am now, after spending time volunteering at a community shelter. It appears my attire led to certain assumptions about who I was, and more importantly, who I was not." The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Evans paused, letting his words sink in. "Today's events serve as a powerful reminder," he said, his gaze sweeping over the room, "that appearances can be deceiving. Authority is not defined by a suit or a robe. It is defined by integrity, respect, and the responsibility we carry for those we serve." The officer who had expelled him stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Your Honor, Judge Evans raised a hand, silencing him. "I will deal with your actions later. For now, I suggest you take a seat and reflect on how quickly you judged someone without knowing the full story." The courtroom was utterly silent, every eye fixed on the man who had proven, without a shred of doubt, that true power lies not in appearances, but in the character beneath. The room was so quiet that the soft rustle of Judge Evans adjusting in his chair sounded deafening. He surveyed the faces before him, the lawyers shifting uneasily, the court officers avoiding his gaze, and the spectators who now looked thoroughly embarrassed. The once smug courtroom was transformed, its earlier arrogance replaced by discomfort and awe. Judge Evans folded his hands on the bench, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Before we begin today's proceedings, I would like to address the events that unfolded this morning." His eyes locked on the officer who had escorted him out. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. "Step forward." The officer hesitated, his face a mix of shame and nervousness. Slowly he walked to the front, standing stiffly before the bench. Judge Evans leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Officer, can you explain why you deemed it necessary to remove me from this courtroom earlier today?" Daniels swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't realize who you were. I thought you were someone who didn't belong here." "And what precisely gave you that impression?" Judge Evans asked, his tone pointed. Daniels hesitated, glancing around the room as if searching for an escape. "It was your clothes, sir. You didn't look like—" He trailed off, realizing too late the weight of his words. "Didn't look like what?" Judge Evans prompted, his voice steady but cutting. Daniels sighed, his shoulders sagging. "You didn't look like a judge." The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Judge Evans sat back, his expression unreadable. "I see. So, in your mind, a judge must dress a certain way, act a certain way, fit a certain mold?" Daniels didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Judge Evans turned his attention to the rest of the room. This officer's actions were not isolated, he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom. Many of you judged me the moment I walked in this morning. Some of you laughed, others whispered. How quick we are to judge based on appearances, and how slow we are to consider the possibility that we may be wrong. The room remained silent, the weight of his words pressing on everyone present. I won't tolerate disrespect in my courtroom, not toward me, and not toward anyone else, Judge Evans continued. Justice isn't about who you think someone is based on what they wear or how they look. It's about the truth, and that truth should be held above all else. Daniels bowed his head. I'm sorry, Your Honor, he said softly. Judge Evans nodded. Apology accepted, but let today serve as a lesson for all of us. Humility, respect, and fairness are not optional, they are mandatory. He turned back to the courtroom, his voice taking on a commanding tone. Now let's proceed with the case at hand. The moment lingered, the power of the judge's words etched into the hearts of everyone present. As they sat down and prepared for the trial, one thing was certain: no one in that room would ever forget the lesson they had learned that day. As the trial commenced, the atmosphere in the courtroom was profoundly different. The earlier arrogance and chatter had been replaced by a quiet respect, not just for Judge Evans, but for the weight of justice itself. Each word he spoke carried a deeper meaning, as if every participant was now more aware of their own biases and actions. Throughout the trial, Judge Evans remained calm and composed, focusing on the facts and ensuring every party was treated fairly. His authority was undeniable, not because of his robe, but because of the wisdom and integrity he brought to the bench. During a recess, whispers once again began to circulate among the spectators, but this time they weren't mocking. Can you believe it? That was the judge the whole time, someone said, shaking their head in disbelief. I've never seen anything like that, another replied. He's not just a judge, he's a lesson in humility. Even the lawyers, who had initially been focused solely on winning their case, seemed to carry themselves differently. They addressed the court with newfound deference, as if they were reminded of the humanity behind the law. As the day drew to a close and the court adjourned, Judge Evans stepped down from the bench. He gathered his papers, his simple attire once again standing in contrast to the polished suits around him. But now, no one doubted his authority. As he walked toward the exit, he passed Officer Daniels, who stood by the door. Daniels hesitated before speaking. Your Honor, thank you for not making an example out of me. I've learned my lesson. Judge Evans paused, offering a faint smile. Good. Use it wisely, officer. We're all here to serve justice, not our egos. With that, he exited the courtroom, leaving behind a room full of people who had been profoundly changed by the events of the day. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the steps of the courthouse. Judge Evans walked away quietly, blending into the city streets as easily as he had entered the courtroom that morning. To the world, he might have looked like just another ordinary man, but to those who had been in that courtroom, he was a symbol, a reminder that power and authority come not from appearances, but from character and integrity. And that day, justice had been served in more ways than one. The story of what happened in the courtroom spread quickly, both among those who had witnessed it firsthand and those who heard it secondhand. By the next day, it had become the topic of conversation in legal circles, social media, and even local news outlets. Judge Evans teaches a powerful lesson on humility. One headline read, "Courtroom Shock. When the judge didn't look like a judge," said another. For many, the story served as a wake-up call. Lawyers and clerks in the courthouse began treating everyone, from janitors to spectators, with greater respect. Officers, reminded of their duty to serve and protect without bias, became more cautious in their assumptions. Among the courtroom staff, Daniels felt the weight of his actions most deeply. Every day, as he returned to his post, he made a point of greeting people politely, no matter their appearance. The incident had left an indelible mark on him, and he was determined to prove that he had learned from it. Even the spectators who had laughed at Judge Evans earlier that day found themselves reflecting on their own behavior. Many of them shared the story with friends and family, emphasizing the lesson about appearances and the importance of reserving judgment. As for Judge Evans, he continued his work quietly, without seeking recognition or fame for what had happened. But his actions that day inspired those around him to rethink how they viewed authority, respect, and the true meaning of justice. Months later, a young law student who had been in the audience that day wrote about the experience in a paper titled "The Day Justice Was Redefined." "It wasn't just a lesson in law," she wrote. "It was a lesson in humanity, a reminder that those who uphold justice must do so with humility, fairness, and an unwavering commitment to the truth." The courtroom incident became more than just a memorable event. It became a catalyst for change, reminding everyone that the heart of justice lies not in appearances, but in character. And in that simple yet profound moment, Judge Evans had shown them all what true authority looked like.